In this course, you will not learn about every battle of the Revolutionary War. Not because they are not important, but because we do not have the time to do so. However, you will learn about the causes and consequences of the war and some of the major events and battles. In this lecture, you are going to learn about the American military forces and war strategy, the British military forces and war strategy, and the attack on Trenton. First, you are going to learn about who served and fought during the American Revolution. As mentioned earlier, the Americans had various local militias, and these same militias will be very helpful in fighting the British. But local colonial militias were best suited for limited engagements, such as responding to the occasional Native American attack or slave rebellion, but they were not for extended wars requiring campaigns far from home. So as you learned earlier, the Americans will establish a continental army. The newly formed Continental Army initially required a 1-year enlistment. But as the war dragged on, they quickly found 1-year enlistments inadequate, and they will encourage 3-year enlistments instead. By offering new soldiers a $20 bonus, while men who committed for the duration of the war were promised a post-war land grant of 100 acres. Most members of the Continental Army did not have much prior formal military experience. They were either former members of the militia or had some military experience in the 7 Years' War. Thus, the American army was at times raw and inexperienced and often undermanned, but it was never as bad as the British assumed. However, men were not the only ones serving as part of the Continental Army. One overlooked factor of the American Revolution is the contribution of women. Although most women did not serve in a formal capacity as part of the Continental Army, they were instrumental during the American Revolution. Close to 20,000 women called camp followers, who were the wives of men in service, also served in the Continental Army, cooking, washing, and nursing the wounded. Some helped during battles, supplying drinking water or ammunition to soldiers. Some 12,000 children also tagged along, and babies were born in the camps. There will also be a few women who will serve in the military pretending to be men, such as Deborah Sampson. Women also increasingly demonstrated a capacity for patriotism at the local level as wartime hardships dramatically altered their work and routines. Women from prominent Philadelphia families formed the Ladies' Association in 1780, which collected money to help support the Continental Army. Black Americans were also active participants during the Revolutionary War. Black Americans were at first excluded from the Continental Army, but as the need for manpower increased, the northern states began to welcome free blacks into service. Even slaves could serve. Some were forced to serve after their masters ordered them, and few volunteered with their master's permission. There will also be a few Native American tribes that would join the American side. When it pertains to how they were going to win the war, the American strategy was relatively straightforward: to repulse and defeat an invading army. The British had one of the most impressive military forces of the time. After all, they had just defeated the other superpowers of the time in the 7 Years' War. So they certainly had the upper hand over the Americans. Moreover, about 1/5 of the American population remained openly loyal to the British monarchy in 1776, and another 2/5 tried to stay neutral. In general, loyalists were people who feared tyranny and who believed the American prosperity and stability depended on a government anchored by monarchy and aristocracy. The most visible and dedicated loyalists were called Tories by their enemies and included royal officials, wealthy merchants, conservative urban lawyers, and some backcountry farmers who resented the power of the pro-revolutionary gentry. In 1776, in New York City, 547 Loyalists signed and circulated a broadside titled A Declaration of Dependence in rebuttal to the July 4 Declaration for Independence, denouncing it as the most unnatural, unprovoked rebellion that ever disgraced the annals of time. So initially, the British Army got some support from these loyalists. Moreover, the British also hired German mercenaries known as Haitians to fight the Americans. There were also African Americans fighting for the British, more so than they did for the Americans. After all, Lord Dunmore and later British General Henry Clinton offered slaves freedom if they ran away and joined the British forces, something the Americans did not. Former slaves primarily served in companies called Black Pioneers as laborers, skilled workers, and spies. It's important to remember that the British motives for offering freedom were practical rather than humanitarian, but the proclamation was the first mass emancipation of enslaved people in American history. Slaves could now choose to run away and risk their lives for possible freedom with the British Army, or hope that the United States will live up to its ideals of liberty. The British were also successful at recruiting Native Americans to fight against the Americans. Here too, will the British have the upper hand as more Native American tribes will fight for the British side than for the American side. Despite their advantages, the British strategy was not as clear as the American one. For a decisive defeat of the Continental Army was essential, but not enough to end the rebellion, and the British would still have to contend with an armed and highly motivated insurgent population. Furthermore, there was no single political nerve center whose capture would spell certain victory for the British. Britain's delicate task was to restore the old colonial governments, not to destroy an enemy country, so British generals were reluctant at first to ravage the countryside, confiscate food, or burn villages and towns. Moreover, the British needed a large land army and counted on the help of Americans who remained loyal to the king. So the overall British plan was a divide and conquer approach, focusing first on New York, the state judged to harbor the greatest number of loyal subjects. Thus, the main action of the first year of the war will be in New York, a city the English thought was crucial. In 1776, the British will launch one of the largest military force expeditions in British history, with thousands of British troops and tens of thousands of German Haitians to take over New York. From the British point of view, New York was the perfect location to launch expeditions aimed at seizing control of the Hudson River and isolating New England from the rest of the continent. For 2 months, the armies engaged in limited scrimmages, but in November, General Howe finally captured Fort Washington and Fort Lee, taking thousands of prisoners. However, Howe failed to press his advantage, allowing for the Continental Army to live yet another day. With the onset of winter, Washington needed something to lift morale and encourage re-enlistment. On Christmas, Washington quietly moved his large army across the Delaware River at night to attack a Haitian camp at Trenton. You may remember this event by these memorable images. Perhaps you remember this one. Or this one. How about this one? Or this one? Either way, Washington will be successful on his surprise attack on the Haitian camp. The victory won the Continental Army much needed supplies and a morale boost following the disaster at New York. It also allowed Washington and his troops to settle in Morristown, New Jersey for the winter. Moreover, there was also a devastating smallpox epidemic taking over the American camps. So with the victory at Trenton, Washington also finally had the time to administer mass smallpox inoculations. The battle at Trenton will also encourage Washington to develop his own logic of warfare that involved smaller, more frequent scrimmages and avoided major engagements that would risk his entire army. As long as he kept the army intact, the war would continue, no matter how many cities the British captured. In the first year of the declared war, the rebellious Americans had a few proud moments, but also many worries. One issue was the American loyalists who continued to aid the British. So, by 1776, state laws defined treason as acts of joining or provisioning the British Army, saying or printing anything that undermined patriot morale, or discouraging men from enlisting in the Continental Army. Wives of loyalists convicted of treason were often allowed to keep 1/3 of their husband's property as long as they were known to be faithful to the American states. Throughout the war, probably 7,000 to 8,000 loyalists fled to England, while 28,000 found closer heaven in Canada. Just as the Americans began to see the British loyalists as traitors, the British will argue that American patriots were the real traitors. Nowhere was this notion of treason more evident than when dealing with prisoners of war. During this time period, humane treatment of captured soldiers was the custom of European military powers, including provision of food, clothing, blankets, and laundry, all paid for by the captive's own government, and the possibility of release via prisoner exchanges was always an option. However, British leaders refused to see the captives as foot soldiers employed by a sovereign nation and treated the captured Americans as traitors worse than common criminals. The British crowded their initial 4,000 prisoners onto dozens of vessels anchored in the river between Manhattan and Brooklyn. On the largest ship, the HMS Jersey, prisoners were kept in a dark, stinking space below decks where more than half a dozen men died daily. The Continental Congress sent food and funds to the prisoners, but only a fraction of it reached the men. Most of it was diverted to British use. More than 15,000 men endured captivity in the prison ships during the war, and 2/3 of them died, a larger number than those who died in battle, estimated to be around 5,000. News of the horrors of the British dead ships increased the resolve of revolutionaries and convinced some neutrals of the necessity of the war. Despite the treatment of his own men, Washington insisted that captured British soldiers be humanely treated. Guarded by local townsmen, the captives typically could move about freely during the day and even hire themselves out to farmers. Officers with money could purchase lodging with private families and mix socially with Americans. Many officers were even allowed to keep their guns. But perhaps one of the biggest obstacles facing the Continental Army was financial instability. As you may remember, the Continental Congress printed money to cover the cost of the war, but shortly after its value deteriorated because the Congress held no reserves of gold or silver to back the currency. Soon the Congress had to resort to other means to produce supplies and labor. One method was to borrow hard money from wealthy men in exchange for certificates of debt, promising repayment with interest. The second method was to pay soldiers with land grants. Despite these obstacles, the war will continue. That is all for now. Please watch the next video lecture to learn what happens next.